So in this lab, we're going to talk about the special senses. We've covered already the cranial nerves and our brain regions, but before we get into specifically the sense of hearing and equilibrium, I just want to review these cranial nerves and think about them in their association with our special senses. Okay, so as we work through these, pause the video occasionally, see if you can answer before I do in the video. This is a great review exercise. So we know that we have 12 cranial nerves, and they're each represented by a Roman numeral and then a name. So which of these cranial nerves is responsible for collecting our auditory information? Which one is associated with hearing? So this is going to be cranial nerve 8, and it is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. And as we go through and talk about the anatomy, we're going to learn that the vestibule is a part of the internal ear anatomy and the cochlea. So maybe that will make more sense now as we go through and talk about the anatomy. So the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. All right, now we're not going to cover vision in this particular lab lesson, but we do still want to think about, because vision is a special sense, we'll cover it in a little bit later video, but what cranial nerve is responsible for vision? So this is one that you identified in your sheep brain dissection. So this is cranial nerve 2, right? This is called the optic nerve. Now, there are 3 other cranial nerves that we tried to learn in a group to put these together because these help with our motor movement. So they help our eyeball to control the movement of our eyeballs. So these are cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 4, and cranial nerve 6. And the names of these are the oculomotor is number 3. So oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. And that one happens to be the smallest. So just as review, that's the smallest of our cranial nerves. And then number 6 is the abducens. So that sounds like a muscle movement, right? The abduction. So these are the 3. When you think about these, you want to think of them in a group, right? These are all serving to control the movement of our eyes. Now, last one on this slide, which cranial nerve is going to be responsible for collecting information about our equilibrium or our balance? So this is also cranial nerve 8, right? This one, the vestibulocochlear nerve, helps us to collect information about balance and equilibrium. All right, so which cranial nerve then is going to be involved in collecting information about smell or our olfactory information? So this one is cranial nerve number 1, right? This is our olfactory nerve. And then what about gustatory? So gustatory means taste. This one, there are actually 2 cranial nerves involved in taste. One is going to make up collecting information from the anterior part of the tongue, kind of the anterior 2/3, and the other one is the posterior third of the tongue. So these are cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve. Okay, so this one is collecting the anterior tongue. So about the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And then the other cranial nerve that's taking care of the posterior part of the tongue is cranial nerve number 9. So this is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So glosso, like tongue, pharyngeal, pharynx, right? So that's pointing us to that area. So this is going to be the posterior part of the tongue. we'll talk more in detail about how this works in lecture, but as we're just reviewing, thinking about these senses, right? There we know already about our cranial nerves. We just want to continue to make the connections as we go through and review what we already know. Now, besides our cranial nerves, we also know something about brain regions. And so let's review what information is collected at what lobe or region of the brain. So our auditory information, okay, and just remember that's coming through the vestibulocochlear nerve, that's cranial nerve 8. This is coming to which lobe of the brain? This is coming to the temporal lobe. Okay. And that's easy for me to remember because I feel like, my ear is right there, right in the temporal area. Now, what about our visual information? We know this is cranial nerve 2, right, the optic nerve, but which lobe of the brain is receiving this from the optic nerve? So this is the occipital lobe of the brain. Now, the key here, right? We have those 3 cranial nerves that are involved in eyeball movement, 3, 4, and 6. And when we're talking about movement, what part or what lobe of the brain deals with movement? So this is going to be the frontal, right? All of our movement is generated, or our somatic movement, from the frontal, but a specific part of the frontal is the motor cortex. Motor cortex, okay? That is the pre-central gyrus, right? That is the important part of our somatic motor functions by the frontal lobe of the brain. Now, what about balance and equilibrium? This is a little more complicated, right? We have several parts that play a role in this, but when we think about one that's very important in this, it would be the cerebellum. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a review. Now we have a couple more senses that we want to talk about. Okay, so what about our taste, our gustatory information? Which part of the brain are we going to process that? So that's the lobe called the insula. That was that interior part that we couldn't see on a lot of the models. Now, what about our smell or our olfactory information? So this is the one that's coming from cranial nerve 1. What part of the brain are we using to process? So for our conscious awareness of identifying scents and smells, this is also going to be the temporal lobe. Now, in lecture, we'll talk more about other areas that olfactory information is processed and how it is related to emotions and memory. But for the lobe, it would be the temporal lobe. Now let's just take a minute and review. So stop and see if you can identify the numbers of all these cranial nerves, and then specifically we'll identify the ones that are associated with our senses. So we have number 1. Remember, we're going to start, right, with number 1. We're going to work down, and we go from in to out. So that's number 1, right? I'm going to use Arabic numbers just so it's a little easier for us to identify these, okay? Number 1, number 2, number 3, 4. Whoops. This one is a good landmark, right? Number 5, this large trigeminal nerve. Then we go back to the middle. This is 6. 7 is that sort of pinkish colored one. 8, 9, and then we say 10, 11, and back up and toward the middle, 12. So if we just review, remember number 1, that's our olfactory nerve. That's the one that's involved in collecting our smell or olfactory information. 2, that's our optic nerve, right? That's collecting that visual information. Then we have 3, 4, and 6. Those are the 3, the ocular motor, the trochlear, and the abducens. Those are the three that are involved in eyeball movement. And then we had 7 and 9. So 7 is the facial nerve, right? 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Those two are involved in taste, the taste buds on our tongue. Okay. And then, did we have any others that I haven't covered? I think that about covers all of our cranial nerves involved in our special senses. No, I forgot one. Sorry, the one we're going to focus on today, the sense that we're focusing on, which is the sense of hearing and equilibrium, and that is our vestibulocochlear nerve or cranial nerve number 8.